Welcome to Medscape from ADA 2024. This is Dr. Akshay Jain, an endocrinologist in Vancouver. I did get the opportunity to attend the ADA 2024 conference in Orlando. And here at Medscape, we are bringing some of the key clinical takeaways from the horse's mouth, so as to speak, from the key presenters. Today, we are very excited to have Dr. Leggio join us all the way from NIH. He is an addiction physician scientist in the intramural research program at NIH. Thanks, Dr. Leggio. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. So we'll get right into this. Your session was, in my mind, extremely informative. The session was basically looking at GLP-1 therapy and its potential effects on mitigating alcohol disuse syndrome, so reduction of alcohol addiction, potentially. Now, Dr. Leggio, we've seen in some of the previous clinical trials, including many from your group, that alcohol use is known to be reduced. Overall risk of incidence as well as recurrence of alcohol use is reduced in individuals who are on GLP-1 therapy. Can you share some more insights about the data that is already out there?
Sure. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think first at the preclinical level, we have a very robust line of studies and experiments and publications looking at the effect of a GLP-1, starting from exenatide up to more recently semaglutide, showing that these GLP-1 receptor agonists do reduce alcohol drinking using different animal models of excessive alcohol drinking, using different species, for example, studies done in mice, in rats, in non-human primates, studies that also use what we call models that reflect the excessive alcohol drinking behavior that we see in patients. For example, physical alcohol dependence, or for example, binge-like alcohol drinking, and other behaviors in animal models that reflect the human condition. In addition to that, we also have seen recently an increase in human evidence that GLP-1 receptor agonists may reduce alcohol drinking. And for example, there are some anecdotal evidence. There are some analysis using social media. So people on GLP-1 receptor agonists who also report drinking less alcohol. And there are also some pharmacoepidemiology studies, which are also very intriguing and quite promising. So in this case, people have been looking at electronic medical records, and they have used the pharmacoepidemiology approaches to match patients who were on GLP-1 receptor agonists because of diabetes, obesity, compared and matched to patients on different drugs as the controls. And these studies, in particular, one study came from Denmark, and another study was recently published and was published in Nature Communications by a group in Cleveland in collaboration with Dr. Neurobiological from the National Institute of Drug Abuse. This study is showing association between being on a GLP-1 receptor agonist and the lower incidence of alcohol use disorder and lower drinking. And finally, there is also some promise from prospective randomized clinical trials. In particular, there was actually one clinical trial from Denmark. So I hate to say from RCT, randomized clinical trial, the field is still in its infancy. So we have one well-known and conducted clinical trial where actually they look at exenatide, and they didn't see an effect of exenatide compared to placebo in the main analysis, but in a sub-analysis, they did see that exenatide reduced alcohol drinking, but only in the patients with alcohol use disorder and obesity. So suggesting that in fact these medications may work for some patients and not for other patients. And that's actually fine, because just like in any other field in medicine, including diabetes, obesity, hypertension, Parkinson's, depression, not all medications work for everybody. So if these medications will work for alcohol addiction, we do not expect that they will work for everybody. And so one ongoing question in the field is to try to identify the phenotypes, the subgroup of people who may be more responsive to these medications.
This is such a fascinating field, all these studies coming out. In your review of all the literature so far, do you think this is dose dependent, number one? And also we see that, like for instance, with certain individuals, when they take GLP-1 therapy, they might have a lot of GI side effects. Recent studies have shown that the rate of these GI side effects does not necessarily correlate with the amount of weight loss. So in the alcohol addictions field, do you think that the GI side effects, things like nausea, could also have a potential role in mitigating the alcohol addiction?
Yeah, this is a great question. So they may play a role, they may contribute to, but we don't think that they are the driving mechanism why people drink less. And I would say for at least a couple of main reasons. One is that similar to the obesity field, the data we have so far don't necessarily show a relationship between the GI side effects and the reduction in drinking. Plus, the reduction in drinking is likely to happen later when many GI side effects are kind of gone or attenuated. So that's one reason. And the second reason is also from the neuroscience field. I think we start now to better understand the mechanism at the brain level, how these medications work. And we don't see that the nausea or more general, not feeling well, malaise, etc., are driving mechanisms for how these medications work. And again, it's not to discount completely that the GI side effects may play a role, but I would say that if anything, they may be more contributing to. And if they do, that will not be unique to this class of medication. For example, we have 3 medications approved by the FDA for alcohol use disorder. And actually, one challenge we have in the addiction field is that many people don't know that these medications exist, like many PCP don't know, and they are completely underutilized. So everybody here who is listening to us knows that roughly 85% of people with diabetes receive a medication for diabetes. For alcohol use disorder, the number is 2%. And these are medications approved by the FDA. But back to your question, the point is, for example, one of them is naltrexone, and naltrexone does give GI symptoms, in particular nausea and vomiting. The other medication is acamprosate, and acamprosate does give diarrhea. So here you go, you have medications approved for alcohol use disorder where you do have some GI symptoms, but they are not the mechanism either for how these medications help people to curb craving and reduce alcohol drinking.
Oh, that's really fascinating. What about the dose-dependent action? So do you think that GLP-1s at a lower dose, they may not have effect on alcohol use disorder and it's a higher dose, or is everyone a little different?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And the short answer is that we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So to be honest, now in some of the animal studies, for example, my team has been doing collaboration with other scientists in the NIH intramural research program, and also with scientists in academia, for example, at Scripps at UCLA, we do see a dose response where the higher is the dose, the higher was the effect of the drug, in this case, semaglutide, in reducing, for example, alcohol self-administration in a rat model of a physical alcohol dependence, a binge-like alcohol drinking in a mouse model of a binge drinking. That said, I would be very, very cautious about claiming, based on the rodent data, that in humans will have a dose response. It's an open question. We really don't know. Some of the pharmacoepidemiology data suggest that even at lower doses, for example, using semaglutide for diabetes without going up to the obesity dose, even lower doses may be just effective as a higher doses in reducing the incidence of alcohol use disorder. But it's important also to keep in mind that, of course, the pharmacoepidemiology data are always an association. So reduction in alcohol use disorder is associated with the prescription of GLP-1, but they don't really replace the more gold standard double-blind, placebo-controlled randomized clinical trial. But nonetheless, at least the pharmacoepidemiology data, I think there is an argument to at least hypothesize that the people may respond well even to lower doses. And this may be also important from a safety standpoint. And also, if we want to combine at some point the GLP-1s with other medications, which could be medications already approved for addiction, or could be, similar to the diabetes obesity field, medications where now you combine different peptides like, GIP, amylin, FGF21, I mean, you name it, right? So, but basically, we need to wait for results in the next years to come from randomized clinical trials to better unfold the question about doses. For example, just anecdotal, I will tell you, in the clinical trial we are conducting right now at the NIH Intramural Research Program, for which I'm the PI, we are going up to 2.4, so the highest dose of a semaglutide. But we are collaborating with Dr. Kyle Simpson from Oklahoma State University. Our two studies are not like a two-site clinical trial, but they are harmonized. In Dr. Simmons' clinical trial, they're going up to 1.0. So we are very excited about this team effort approach we are taking, because the trials are slightly different, but they are harmonized to the point that once the studies are done, we'll be able to combine and compare data to better answer the question about dosing and many other questions.
Oh, that's amazing. Because, from a clinical perspective, we see that many people that are battling with alcohol use disorder, they may not have obesity. They might actually be on the leaner side, and hence we may not want to use a high dose of GLP-1 therapy. So it'll be very exciting to see when these results come out. Which brings me to the next question. I think everyone would love to know, why does this happen, right? Why is GLP-1 having its effect on alcohol use disorder? Now, I know that your group has done a lot of animal studies, as you pointed out, and one of the postulated theories was the effect on the GABA neurotransmission pathway. Can you tell us more about what you feel is the underlying mechanism of action here?
Right. Yes. And I think I will start by prefacing that we don't fully know. That's the reality. There are many still open questions. But if I can sidetrack for 1 second, we come up with the idea that first of all, alcohol use disorder and substance use disorder, these are addictive behaviors, addictive disorders. And we define addiction as a brain disease. Now, granted that addiction is a brain disease, it doesn't mean that addiction works just in the brain in isolation. As we all know, the brain works in concert with the rest of the body. And one specific approach my team has been taking is really by work on the analogy and the similarities between obesity and addiction to really try to understand how the body-brain connections, such as gut-brain neuroendocrine pathways, may play a role in patients with addiction. So with that in mind, a lot of work in my lab in the last 20 years, since I've been a PI pretty much, has been focused on studying these neuroendocrine pathways related to gut-brain axis. For example, we have done work on insulin, leptin, and primarily we have done work on ghrelin, and since 2015 on the GLP-1. So with that in mind, the framework that we are working on, and also substantiated by many studies done by our team and other teams in the neuroscience field, kind of supported the idea that similar to what we see in obesity, these medications may work by affecting what we call reward processing, the seeking for addictive drugs such as alcohol, and also the drugs such as the stimulants, opioids, nicotine, and so on. So the whole idea is that the mechanism is driven by the ability of the medication, semaglutide and all the GLP-1 receptor agonists, to reduce the rewarding properties of alcohol and drugs. To make it, maybe make the example more pragmatic, what does that mean? It means, for example, that a patient who typically drinks 10 drinks per day in the afternoon/night, while they are on the medication, they may feel the lack of need to drink up to 10 to feel the same reward. They may be able to stop after 2, 3 drinks. So, which means a significant harm reduction beneficial outcome. This also brings to another mechanism, which may be related to satiety, right? So, and this actually still we don't fully understand about how much satiety mechanism, including satiety mechanism related to GI motility, may also play a role. But with that said, we don't think that the effect of a GLP-1 receptor agonist are merely due to alcohol being a calorie-based sort of nutrient, because in fact, we see alcohol as an addictive drug, not as a nutrient, but also because the GLP-1, at least in animal models, they seem to work also on other addictive drugs that don't have calories, such as nicotine, possibly even cannabis, and opioids and stimulants. And then on the molecular level, for example, our team recently showed, in collaboration with Dr. Marisa Roberto from Scripps in La Jolla, California, that semaglutide may in fact change the GABA transmission at the level of some brain regions, such as the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. And these are brain regions that are well-established hubs that play a role in the mechanism underlying addiction. There are also some very recent data, for example, very exciting, showing how these medications may work not just on GABA or just on dopamine, which is the canonical way how we conceive of reward processing, but kind of working on both by modulating GABA transmission, for example, at the ventral tegmental area, and the dopamine transmission at the nucleus accumbens. So bottom line, if I should summarize all of this, I would say that the mechanism is not fully understood, but there is definitely a contribution of this medication in affecting reward processing, possibly by changing the balance between GABA and the dopamine. And there are still some unknown questions, such as, for example, are these mechanisms all brain-driven, or they are signaling from the periphery to the brain, or maybe both? Also, because as we all know, there are many differences across all these GLP-1 analog in brain penetrance, and whether the drug needs to go to the brain to have an effect on alcohol drinking or cocaine seeking or smoking is really an open question.
This is so thought-provoking, and I guess the more we uncover, the more mesmerized we get with all the potential crosstalk that's happening. A lot of overlap in the brain with each of these different things and how it all interplays with each other. So that's really good. Speaking of interplay, I'm thinking, a lot of people who are prone to having alcohol use disorder can potentially develop complications. One of these being chronic pancreatitis. So we know that this is a well-known complication that can occur in people having alcohol addiction. And along that same line, we know that previous history of pancreatitis is considered a use with caution, or we don't want to use GLP-1 therapy in people who have had pancreatitis. So now it becomes this quagmire where people may have chronic pancreatitis, but we may want to consider GLP-1 therapy for management of alcohol use disorder. What are your thoughts about this and the safety potentially in using it in these patients?
Right. This is another wonderful question. that's definitely a top priority in our mind to also address this kind of questions. For example, our RCT, our randomized clinical trial, does have as a core primary outcomes, not only the efficacy defined as a reduction in alcohol drinking, but also safety. And the reason is exactly for what you just explained. There are many unanswered questions, including whether, for example, giving a GLP-1 receptor agonist and alcohol together may have a synergistic effects and increases the likelihood of having pancreatitis. The good news is that so far, based on the published literature, including the RCT that was done with exenatide in Denmark and published in 2022, and also the ongoing clinical trials, including my own clinical trial, but of course we are blind, but so far pancreatitis has not been coming out as an adverse event. However, it's also true that, as often happens in a clinical medication development, of course, we screen and select our population well. So, for example, we do exclude people who have a history of a pancreatitis. We do exclude people with high lipase or with any of the clinical symptomatology that makes us concerned about these people having pancreatitis. So in a sense, as often happens as you move a medication from clinical trials to clinical practice, we still need to understand if these medications work in patients. But if they do, even if, I'm just speculating, but even if the clinical trials will not rise red flags in terms of increased risk of some side effects such as pancreatitis, I think it will be very important for practitioners to keep a close eye on the death risk regardless. It's very interesting that it's similar to alcohol liver disease. With pancreatitis, not every single patient with alcohol addiction does have a pancreatitis. And we don't really fully understand why some people develop a pancreatitis, some people do not. So point being that there are many patients with alcohol addiction who don't have a pancreatitis and may benefit from these medications if they work. Again, we had to prove that in patients. But on the other side, as we all know, pancreatitis is potentially life-threatening condition for those people who either have a pancreatitis or are at the risk of pancreatitis. I think we have to be extra very careful before we consider, giving them a GLP-1 agonist. One could argue, well, alcohol is a leading cause of mortality and morbidity in the world. It's actually really one. For example, right now, alcohol is the leading cause of liver disease. It's the main reason for liver transplantation in our country. And actually, alcohol is affecting thousands of people in terms of death and emergency room visits, etc. So you could argue the downside is not treating these people and they die because of alcohol addiction. But GLP-1 is not going to be for everybody. And I will remind everybody that A, we do have FDA-approved medications for alcohol addiction. And B, there are also other medications that are not approved by the FDA, but they have a proven efficacy in some clinical trials, for example, taparametic gabapentin, and they've been endorsed by the American Psychiatric Association. There is also some evidence for another medication, baclofen, at least has been endorsed by the American Gastroenterology, the American College of Gastroenterology for patients with alcohol addiction, liver disease. So the point I'm making is not that either we use the GLP-1s or we have no other tools. We have other tools, and so I think we have to personalize the treatment based on the patient's profile from a safety standpoint and from a phenotypic standpoint.
Yeah, I love that thought. I think individualization is the key here. We know that people with diabetes on and on, they do have a higher risk of pancreatitis by virtue of having diabetes. People with obesity also have a higher risk of pancreatitis by virtue of having obesity. And these are the two conditions where we are using a lot of GLP-1 therapy. So again, the idea is looking at the person in front of us and then deciding based on their past medical history, their current risk, whether or not a medication is a right fit for them. I think more along the lines of of individualization here. And as again, we start using these medications that might be having potential effects on different organ systems. You mentioned a little bit about the liver. So a thought came in my mind. We know that people with diabetes, those who have alcohol use disorder, they are at a higher risk of potential hypoglycemia, especially if they have events when they have increased consumption of alcohol. There can be more hypoglycemia. And we now could potentially be using semaglutide or other GLP-1 therapy for management of alcohol use disorder. In your own experience in the studies that you've done or the literature that's out there, has that been associated with an even higher risk of hypoglycemia?
It's a wonderful question. So I'm not aware of any, at least a formal and published report of that association. But that said, I think you're thinking from a clinical, from a physiopathology standpoint, makes totally sense, and I could not agree more. So the fact that nothing has been published, well, at least to my knowledge, it doesn't mean that risk does not exist. In fact, I agree with you that I think it does exist. Alcohol use disorder is actually interesting and tricky clinically, because chronically, alcohol addiction, alcohol use disorder is associated with an increased risk of diabetes. But acutely, as you point out, and this could be with or without alcohol use disorder, an episode of a high volume binge drinking may lead to hypoglycemia. Actually, one of the reasons why people may show up to the emergency room, or they show up to the emergency room with intoxication, and one of the symptoms detected at the emergency room is that they also have a hypoglycemia, in addition to vomiting, nausea, and everything else that we see in patients with acute intoxication. So I think that similar to the discussion about pancreatitis, as we keep on working in understanding the possible role of GLP-1 receptor agonist in patients with alcohol use disorder, I think we do have to keep a close eye on the risk of hypoglycemia. So the short answer is that this is not well established, but I think that based on the simple concept of first do no harm, I think we need to track that very carefully. In the ongoing clinical trial we are doing in Maryland, in my program, the NIH Intramural Research Program, we do just that. We are tracking glucose levels, but of course, patients come to your patient clinic weekly, so unless they have symptoms, typically we don't see anything at the time. But more important, we educate our patients when they do through the consent process. We tell them, listen, this medication per se does not give hypoglycemia. And in fact, since we're excluding people with diabetes, so people on other medication like metformin, etc., we explain to them that technically such a risk should not exist, except because you are actually drinking alcohol in excessive amounts, you do have a potential higher risk, and we just don't know how significant that risk could be. But we do a lot of education at the baseline when they enroll in our study, and we also educate our patients on how to recognize early on the potential risk of a hypoglycemia, exactly for the reasons you say, that we explain to them the unknown potential that the GLP-1s and alcohol together may synergize and give hypoglycemia.
Wow. I don't know if you got this feeling at the ADA conference, but I felt that, attending all these sessions, it seems like GLP-1 is the gift that keeps giving. We see its effect on diabetes, obesity, metabolic associated steatotic liver disease, on possibly with Alzheimer's, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, so many things. And now, of course, potential use in alcohol use disorder. So do you think that using GLP-1 therapy is ready for prime time? Do you think that we are now ready to prescribe this in people with alcohol use disorder?
Yeah, I would say we're not there yet. We are very, very excited. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the evidence keeps on growing and being stronger and stronger, because the positive data keep on coming up. Data from animal models, including different species ranging from rodents to non-human primates, anecdotal evidence, machine learning approaches using, for example, big data, social media data, etc. Now pharmacoepidemiology data, some small initial but still good randomized clinical trials. But what we are missing is really now the final, if you will, step of having a substantial number of a prospective double-blind placebo-controlled clinical trials to really prove or disprove whether these medications work, and to also better understand which patients may respond to these medications. The good news is that there are many ongoing clinical trials. So we are conducting a clinical trial in Maryland at the NIH. Dr. Simmons is doing a clinical trial in Oklahoma State University. Dr. Christian Henderson at UNC is conducting a study at Chapel Hill. Dr. Josh Sachs is doing a study in Colorado. Dr. Anders Flint-Jens is doing a study in Denmark. So the momentum is very high. And actually, I'm only mentioning those people who are doing alcohol semaglutide clinical trials, but there are also people doing clinical trials in smoking, on stimulants, opioids. There are actually some very fresh, still unpublished, but presented public at conference data from Penn State showing how these drugs may reduce opioid craving, which is, of course, critically important given that we're in the middle of a fentanyl pandemic, which is really killing one person every 7 minutes, for example, in Baltimore. So it's very, very alarming, and we need more treatments. So bottom line is very promising, but we need to really wait for these clinical trials to have a definitive answer. I would say, of course, if you have a patient, for example, with diabetes, with obesity, and this patient also has an alcohol addiction, and they are on a semaglutide or any other GLP-1 receptor agonist, and in addition to using the medication for diabetes and or obesity, they also have a beneficial effect on the alcohol drinking, that's fantastic. At the end of the day, that's the mission we all share, helping people. But if it's someone without obesity, diabetes, personally at this stage, I will go with all the medications that either have FDA approval or at least a very solid evidence of efficacy from RCT, rather than going with the GLP-1, at least until I don't see more definitive data from randomized clinical trials. But there is a lot of hope. We are very hoping that this clinical trials will be positive. We are very enthusiastic. And we're also very thrilled to see that Novo Nordisk actually recently launched a gigantic multi-site clinical trial with, I forgot how many sites, but it's really very large across Europe, America, and maybe other continents as well. And their primary outcome is actually improvement in alcohol liver disease, but they're also looking at alcohol drinking as a secondary outcome. And that's very important because unlike in the diabetes field, in the addiction field, we do struggle to build partnership with the private sector because sometimes the addiction field is not seen as an appetitive field from pharma. And we all know that the best success in any medication development story is when you put academia, the government, and pharma together. Just let's think about the COVID vaccine development. And so that's unfortunately the exception rather than rule in the addiction field. But with the company doing a large clinical trial in the alcohol field, although they focus on the liver, but still they also look at drinking, I really hope that we'll see more and more private companies in the private sector more and more interested in addiction. And then also I hope to see more and more partnership between private sector, the government, and academia.
Such exciting times indeed. We can't wait enough for the results of these and many other trials to come out. Dr. Leggio, it was an absolute delight chatting with you today. Thank you so much for joining us at Medscape from 88 2024.